I'm Roger Wallace, and I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center, an institution that all of you, I think, know, committed to public dialogue and advanced research. The Wilson Center has had a long-term commitment to the relationship between our two neighbors, Mexico and Canada. And we've just celebrated the 5th anniversary of the Center's Mexico Institute. I have the pleasure of co-chairing the advisory board of this institute, which seeks to build dialogue between our two countries, along with my good friend Jose Antonio, who you will hear from in a moment. The advisory board brings together outstanding leaders from all walks of life from our two countries. And most of you will hear over the next 3 hours are members of this distinguished group. This year is crucial for the U.S. Mexico relationship. Our country will elect a new president and Congress that will have the opportunity to take our relationship with our neighbor to the south in new, fruitful directions. We have had real advances in cooperation with Mexico over the last few years. Every day, the economic relationship between our countries grow. So too the bonds of friendship and family, the ability of governments to work together to address important issues of security and trade. However, we've also experienced a loss of creative energy between our countries. Our government has been focused on commitments in other parts of the world and economic challenges at home. Some in Mexico have grown skeptical of the willingness of our country to engage, as we've allowed important issues between our countries to go unresolved, and voices on both sides of the border have risen that question the wisdom of our working together. It will be important for a new administration and Congress to reinvigorate this relationship and make a case for strong bilateral cooperation to solve common problems. We cannot address the challenges of immigration, border security, or economic growth without working together. Today's panel will look at how these issues might be dealt with in this year's campaign and how a new administration and Congress might address them once the election is done. Now, before we get started, I want all of you to pretend like you're on an airplane. I want you to take out your electronic devices, and I want you to turn them off. Now, even if you have them on vibrate, I'm told, it interferes with the system here. So please, as I'm getting ready to do, and I obviously have a new voicemail waiting, turn them off. And now I'm going to turn it over to my distinguished co-chair, Jose Antonio Fernandez.
Thank you, Roger. Good morning, everybody. I'm quite sure you have heard some of these words many, many times before. However, I think it's important to always start our meetings with some of the ideas that to get moving our thoughts towards the direction of the principles of our institute. Without a doubt, one of the most intense bilateral relations in the world today is between Mexico and the U.S. We need to study and promote dialogue about this relationship, again, in order to build better joint public policies so that we can improve the quality of life of citizens of both nations. This is no longer a good idea. I think it is an imperative. We are two interdependent nations, and we need to understand this clearly. Certainly, our authorities need to understand this, but most importantly, our societies. We have established a successful commercial connection between the two countries, and migration has created bonds among citizens on both sides of the border. However, we need to design new instruments that will allow us to have a more strategic relationship, one that is both respectful and realistic about the conditions and aspirations of citizens of both sides of the border. Therefore, we need to deal with the shared challenge of security, regulate migration flows, which is good for everybody if it's regulated properly, in very new and creative and legal ways, and find approaches to make trade and investments benefit the largest number of people possible in both countries. But today we have another great opportunity to discuss how the U.S. elections will affect the relationship between the two countries. We have an outstanding group of panelists who will look at what issues might be on the table: trade, migration, security, and the quality of life of border communities, and how a future U.S. administration may relate to Mexico and the Mexican government to a new U.S. administration. I am convinced that this is a vital moment to talk about new vigorous partnership between the U.S. and Mexico. The elections in the United States will open up an opportunity, another opportunity to renew and bring new energy to our relationship. We can hope that a new government in the U.S. places a priority on the relationship with Mexico and looks for creative strategies to renew the partnership between the two countries. We must think of this region as a community that seeks a better development through collaborative public policies and clear binational agenda that is not only restricted to government efforts but also involves civil society and the private sector. Thank you very much again for coming. I hope you enjoy this program.
Thank you, Jose Antonio and Roger. I want to thank them for all the leadership they give to the Mexico Institute. They're the co-chairs of an extremely dynamic and active advisory board. You'll be hearing from many of the other members who are here today shortly in the two panels that follow. But first I want to introduce one of the great commentators and thinkers on American politics who's agreed to be with us here today. Michael Barone is I think all of you probably know him, is a Fox News commentator. He writes in U.S. News and World Report. His articles are circulated widely, and never more so than an election year. And so we very much appreciate him showing up in the middle of an election year. And though he doesn't know this, I remember this morning, I was mentioning to Gabby, that he actually played a role in my life, actually, in my interest in politics. I remember as a 16-year-old teenager, when my parents asked me what I wanted for my birthday, I said, I'd like the Almanac of American Politics. Now, my parents, I think, were somewhat shocked and worried by this, but they were happy I wasn't asking for a tattoo or a motorcycle or a trip to Europe, so they went out and had spent $16 in the Almanac of American Politics. It was way back then. This was a few years ago here. You know. Yeah. But truly, all that to point out, aside from being a personal story about Michael Barone, that it really is sort of the fixture for those that follow American politics. I mean, this is the reference guide that we have to our political system. He's a person who has been really trying to explain to us for the past 3 decades more, the way our system works, and we really appreciate him taking time out to do this in the middle of a very busy season for him. And he has a special appreciation for Mexico. We've talked about this on an earlier occasion, and so hopefully you can tell us a little bit what we should expect in this campaign and foreign policy, and anything that you might see in terms of some of the issues that might affect Mexico. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be introduced by somebody who, as he explained, typifies my original target audience for the Almanac of American Politics, which is teenage boys who are politics nerds. Myself at 16, basically. That's what I've seen as my target audience throughout, and I'm glad that we've all been admonished to turn off our cell phones, because you never know when you're going to get a call from Rudy Giuliani's wife. I've been interested, obviously, in American politics for a long time, and I've developed interest in Mexico politics. I was in Mexico for the 2000 and 2006 elections and in the run-up to them. I guess this comes part because I grew up on the border, that is north of Canada, in Detroit, Michigan. It's always good for puzzling people for a little while. You live in the North Pole. Whatever. In any case, as I was thinking about this event this morning, it occurred to me that there's a certain amount of symmetry between the election in Mexico in 2006 and the United States in 2008, certain similarities. In both cases, you've had an incumbent who came into office with great expectations, particularly on U.S. Mexico relations, and had something of a disappointing record. you've had the incumbent's party nominating a candidate who was really of a distinct faction, of a different part of his political party, from, in the case of both Felipe Calderon from Vicente Fox and John McCain from George W. Bush. In each case, the opposition party nominated a man little known in much of the country, Barack Obama, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and a man who was of a certain amount of charisma, so much so that he inspired certain works of art. There are these retro posters of Obama and the videos of Obama Girl that have come out. And, of course, there was that caricature of AMLO that one saw everywhere in Mexico in the run-up to the 2006 election. None of these candidates were from traditional party establishments, and all represented some amount of change in policy and approach. I think the similarities obviously drop off at some point. You've got a three-party system in Mexico, a two-party system in the United States. But I think nonetheless, we are at a sort of fulcrum point of change in personnel and in policy. As I look back on this election, we're just about at the midpoint in the election between the Iowa caucuses January 3rd and the general election November 4th. It's interesting to me that U.S. politics has operated very differently from the way we've been accustomed in the 2000-2004 cycle and in the off-year elections. We had a pretty steady period in which I call trench warfare politics, two approximately equal-sized parties, not much in the way of defections, not many undecided voters. The big challenge was to get your army of voters out in large numbers in the general election. We, in fact, had huge increases in turnout in 2004 as both the Democratic and the Republican candidates did unprecedented jobs of voter turnout, registering new voters. You had very few undecided voters. You had politics tending to divide people along lines, particularly of religion, and with the more observant tending to support the Republicans, the less observant or unobservant tending to support the Democrats. And you had a situation where we knew the election would be close, but there wasn't much movement during the course of the election between George W. Bush and Al Gore in 2000, between George W. Bush and John Kerry in 2004. We had relatively stable party preferences. 47 of the 50 states voted for the same party's candidate in 2004 as they had in 2000. This year seems to me to be different. We've got what I call open field politics, where voters are moving around, candidates are moving around. There have been a lot of changes and a lot of surprises. And that's been true in the selection of the party's nominees. Neither the Democratic or Republican candidate was nominated in the usual way, by sweeping most of the presidential primaries. That didn't happen this time. It was different, and different in both parties. John McCain was nominated by narrow margins combined with winner-take-all rules. In January, he won the New Hampshire primary by 5 points, South Carolina by 3, Florida by 5. Super Tuesday, February 5th, he won the majority of delegates. He won Missouri by 1 point, California by 7 points, but he carried 48 of the 53 congressional districts there, and so he won the great bulk of the delegates. He really got far less than half the primary votes when the nomination was seriously contested. But since the Republicans tend to have winner-take-all allocation of delegates, he was effectively nominated February 5th, pretty much officially, or became the presumptive candidate, as we say on TV, or the presumptive nominee by March 4th. And even though a lot of Republicans, perhaps a majority of Republican primary voters, didn't really back him. On the Democratic side, we had a much longer race. Many of us had predicted that the Democratic nomination would be decided quickly. The Republican nomination would take a long time to be determined. as is often the case with us political pundits, we were wrong on all counts. In fact, it was the Democratic primary contest that stretched out, and Barack Obama, interestingly, if you just take the states where they held primaries, the form of presidential selection that involves the largest number of people, Barack Obama actually won fewer delegates than Hillary Clinton, as she will be happy to tell you. He won his plurality of delegates in the caucus states and from the superdelegates, the 700 or so Democratic public office holders and party officials who have votes, automatic votes at the Democratic National Convention. The Clinton failed to take, really to contest the caucus states very well. She didn't think Idaho was important. It turned out that Obama got a larger delegate edge in Idaho, which has a little over 1 million people, than Hillary Clinton got from winning the primary in New Jersey, which has 8 million. She was the winner. There was a point there when I sort of felt that, how could we explain Hillary Clinton's persistence? And I explained to people that actually the secret fact that she was born in the year 1200, and she has been here long before all of us were here, and will be here long after we're all gone. But she did persist. I think that, why did Hillary Clinton make this inexplicable mistake? Well, I think part of it was that she counted on winning the votes of a lot of black voters. And as late as December, the polls in South Carolina, which was the most polled state with a significant number of black voters, showed her splitting the black vote roughly evenly with Obama. If that had continued to be the case, she would have been nominated on Super Tuesday, given the lineup of primaries that existed in January and February 5th. In fact, after Obama won the Iowa caucuses, black voters in South Carolina and other states switched almost entirely to him, and that I think more than anything else was the reason that Clinton failed to win the nomination. The Mexico election back in July 2006, as I think all of you in the room appreciate, turned it out to be exceedingly close. I can remember watching the broadcast on Televisa and TV Azteca. They brought the chairman of the IFE on and sort of said that will be all for tonight, but with Calderon very narrowly ahead. And the U.S. election could turn out to be just as close. If you look at current polls, Obama currently has a lead in the polls. He's gotten a bump upwards in the polls after clinching the nomination last week. The RealClearPolitics.com average, he's now ahead 47-43 in recent polls, a 4-point edge. That's a little below the 48-43 he had in polls from Super Tuesday until March 13th, the days when ABC and Fox News started broadcasting the tapes of the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, his pastor and spiritual mentor, as he put it, for 20 years. It's just about the same number as he had from March 13th through June 3rd, which was 47-44 if you average all the national polls. If you take a look at the polls in the different states, because as we know, we determine the outcome of the presidential election not by popular vote but by electoral vote, I went through the exercise of averaging these out. From February to May, McCain leads in 29 states with 281 electoral votes. Obama leads in 21 states and the District of Columbia with 257 electoral votes. In other words, just about the same number. And moreover, some of the leads for both candidates were microscopic. Some of the polls were probably wrong. Some states you didn't have very many polls. It seems that we're very possibly headed towards another close election. But it's an election, if it's close, it's being run on a different map from that familiar map of the red states and the blue states from what we had in 2000 and 2004. Survey USA did a 50-state survey, McCain-Obama, McCain-Clinton. They found that 15 of the 50 states had electoral votes going different ways depending on which Democrat was the nominee. That's a big contrast from 2000, 2004, when 47 of the 50 states voted for the same party. McCain has narrow leads in some familiar target states, Michigan, Missouri, New Hampshire, Iowa, but he also leads narrowly in some states that has only narrow leads in some states that weren't on the target list at all last time. North Carolina, Virginia, Montana, Alaska. Obama has narrow leads in some familiar target states, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but also in states that weren't on the target lists in 2000 and 2004, Colorado and New Jersey. Moreover, some states that were prime targets in 2000 and 2004 may not be this time. McCain has significant leads in Florida, which is was the key close state, obviously, in the 2000 election, and West Virginia, which between 1928 and 2000 only voted for Republicans for president when they were incumbents headed for landslide victories. Obama is leading by significant margins in polls in Minnesota, Oregon, Wisconsin. So some of the states that were on the target list last time may fall off the target list. New states will go on the target list, I think, or are on there already. It's time to throw out the map of the red states and the blue states and look at different states that will be important. And you can see reflections on this political map of what I call the tribal warfare that was apparent in the results in the Democratic primaries. Obama clearly underperforms among older voters, downscale white voters, Latino voters, Jewish voters, and Appalachian voters, people from that great swath of the mountains from southwest Pennsylvania through West Virginia and going down into Tennessee, northern Alabama, and so forth, where he ran very poorly in the primaries and is running far behind John McCain in the general election. It's also an election where I think the old rules about the effect of the economy on political choice may no longer be operative. In Mexico in 2006, we had the northern part of Mexico, which is economically more vibrant, voted heavily for Felipe Calderon, the PAN party. Lopez Obrador tended to carry, though not by overwhelming margins, the southern states that have lagged behind in economic growth. The sort of rule seems to be that where you have economic problems, the left party wins. Where you have economic growth, the right party wins. Doesn't necessarily seem to be the same in the United States. As I look at the polls and at the political developments in different states and in states that have been close or look like they will be close in this election, I see that John McCain is actually running as well as George W. Bush or better in Michigan, which has the nation's highest unemployment, and in Ohio, which has had economically ailing problems. There's actually, in economically distressed areas, there seems, if anything, to be a move toward the Republican nominee. In contrast, Barack Obama is running significantly better than John Kerry or Al Gore did in economically vibrant states, in states that have had substantial growth, Virginia and North Carolina. Those two states seem likely to be seriously contested this time. They weren't really in 2000, in 2004. So that I think we haven't fully grasped how the economic issues will play out in this election. And it's interesting to watch what's been happening in the Congress in the last week. Democrats brought forward in the Senate a bill on carbon emissions to attack the problems asserted to be created by global warming. They kind of dropped it like a hot potato. When we've got $4 a gallon gasoline, it seems that public opinion has turned around on the issue of whether we should do more oil drilling and oil development domestically. And the Republicans are now saying, look, let's drill in Alaska. Who cares about the caribou and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and so forth? And so economic issues may not work the way that people expected. But I think not only the economy, but foreign policy will also be an issue in this campaign. In 2006, Iraq and the struggle in Iraq was a huge liability for the Republicans, and the reason, more than anything else, why they lost their majorities in both houses of Congress. But it's an issue, in my judgment, that could work more for John McCain. He has been an advocate since the summer of 2003 of the surge strategy, which, in the view of most voters, has succeeded and is promising a successful outcome there, which nobody a year and a half ago thought would happen. I mean, Harry Reid said last April, the Senate Majority Leader, that the war in Iraq was lost. It looks different now, and that issue could turn around and perhaps work in McCain's favor rather than to his detriment. It's also he's also been profiting from some of Obama's mistakes or miscues, or at least I think that's what they are, like saying that he would meet without preconditions with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Hugo Chavez. Obama has been talking about America being more respected, more liked, more admired in the world with him as a leader. But at the same time, he's staunchly opposed the free trade agreement with Colombia, which McCain has announced he will visit soon, and has called for renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico and Canada. Now, it's true, one of his economic advisors, University of Chicago economics professor Austin Goolsbee, well-respected economist, told the Canadian Consul General in Chicago that he shouldn't take this very seriously, that Obama really isn't going to renegotiate NAFTA. He's just saying this to appease the labor unions at home. And I think ultimately the chances for renegotiation of NAFTA in an Obama administration are not high. But nonetheless, with the labor unions providing key manpower and money for the Democrats' campaign and for their get-out-the-vote efforts, Obama clearly has signaled a different approach on trade and specifically on NAFTA than we have had from the Bush, Clinton, Bush administrations going back 15 or 20 years. On the issue of immigration, which I know is of interest to people in Mexico, McCain was one of the sponsors of the so-called comprehensive immigration bill that included guest worker and legalization provisions. He took a lot of flack from Republicans, many in the Republican Party on that. The talk radio was lambasting him as pro-amnesty. And it was one of the reasons that many conservatives said that he couldn't win the Republican nomination. Well, he did win the Republican nomination, but the fact that that immigration bill was defeated in the Senate in spring of 2006 and again in the spring of 2007 in both the Republican and Democratic majority Senates has led McCain to take a somewhat different rhetorical position. He's now saying, look, we've got to secure the border first. We've got to insist on border enforcement. He doesn't talk as much about workplace enforcement. But in fact, as a practical matter, the Bush administration has done some things to increase border enforcement. And some of the states have passed fairly draconian laws on illegal immigrants, which appear from anecdotes at least, to have had some effect in terms of deterring people from going there or having illegal immigrants actually move out of those states and go either to other states or back to Mexico. In any case, Obama supported the comprehensive bill, but he also cast some votes for provisions that would have upset the compromise that McCain and Edward Kennedy had worked out, and which they hoped would have produced a majority in the Senate. It didn't, but they hoped it would. What are the prospects for immigration legislation in a new administration? Well, it's in my judgment, the Democratic leadership in the House is reluctant to bring up the issue. They've got a significant body of members who are uncomfortable, either on substantive grounds or for fear of political retaliation by the voters for bringing that up. My own guess is that in an Obama administration, which would call for significant legislation on carbon emissions, on health care, perhaps on taxes, immigration would probably not come to the forefront in the next Congress. In a McCain administration, I think, again, the prospects for legislative action are dim. It's possible that there could be some kind of a bipartisan agreement on that. In some ways, legislation like that is easier to pass if both parties have to take some responsibility for it. But I think it's also possible to see how even a bipartisan agreement would not summon up the necessary majority or the Senate supermajority that you need in order to actually pass legislation. We are just people always ask me who's going to win the election. The fact is that I'm very reluctant I'm even more reluctant to make predictions this time than I was last time. 4 years ago, we had a pretty good idea about how almost every state would vote. Now we don't. We have two candidates this time who have greater upside potential in terms of winning votes, but also greater downside potential, I think, than either of the two nominees in 2000 and 2004. So I think this is going to be a very close election. It will have, obviously, important consequences. In terms of making a prediction, I think almost the best thing I can say is that one of the candidates will win. The disadvantage of a zero-sum game is that all but one of the players must lose. The advantage of a zero-sum game is that one player must win. Whatever happens, we'll know the day after the election, or perhaps 33 days after the election, as we did in 2000. I will just leave you with an anecdote back from the election of 2000. I was at Fox News headquarters in New York preparing for the late evening turned out broadcast, and we got the first tranche of exit poll results about 12:45 p.m. around lunchtime, and I took a look at the results in all the close states that we had all been following. And they were very close indeed. And I had a two-word comment of which I will share only the first word with you, which was, "Oh." Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We don't want to get behind on our schedule here, but it would be remiss if we didn't let there be a few questions from the audience. So let's take a round of about 3 questions for Michael Barone, and then we'll let him do 2-word answers. How's that? Susan. Susan Kaufman-Purcell from the University of Miami.
Mr. Barone, thank you very much.
Susan.
If we assume for a second that Obama wins and there is a stronger Democratic Congress, both houses, to what extent would he still be hampered in terms of the degree of change, big ideas being implemented? Is there something about the U.S. system that even with everything under Democratic control and even with good margins, better than ever, that he still would find it rather difficult to implement more dramatic kinds of changes?
Well, control is a funny word in U.S. politics, particularly in the Senate, where Senator McConnell was able to get 10 hours devoted to the reading of the climate change bill by just interposing an objection by one senator. I think the answer is it is a hard system to control. And I would, refer you to the episode with the Clinton health care plan in 1993-94, when Democrats had majorities in Congress considerably larger than they have now, and possibly larger than they will have in 2007, when they probably will have larger majorities. It's a complicated country. You know, we're going to reform the healthcare system. We don't have just one healthcare system in the U.S. We have many healthcare systems, many healthcare delivery systems, finance systems, many players. And understandably, they all wanted to take a part. Now, both McCain and Obama have been crusading against lobbyists in various ways. I think they're going to put forward a bill that says there's got to be a big red L on their foreheads. They're not allowed inside campaign headquarters. They can't vet the vice presidential nominee, whatever. You know, lobbyists are terrible. But we have lobbyists for a reason, which is that government channels huge flows of money, affects people's lives in multifarious ways. And so, you know, whether you're talking about, you know, a climate change bill, which amounts in effect to a higher tax on energy use, higher cost on energy use. As we've seen in the recent Congress, the Democrats kind of skedaddled away from that. Health care, you face some of the same problems that Hillary Clinton and her actually very smart advisors faced in 1993-94. Tax changes, I think there's forces moving for that, but that is, you know, that becomes a very difficult and complex issue. So, you know, Obama in the platforms, you know, gets up there and says, we are the change we are seeking. When you start getting more specific than that, it may not be as easy as that rhetoric suggests.
Is there another question? Cindy Arntzen, Director of the Latin American Program at the Wilson Center.
Thanks very much. Given the state of the economy, the rising levels of unemployment, gas prices, and an explicitly populist pitch by the Obama campaign, why do you see that that issue is not gaining more traction, and that in some of this, I think you broke down the states where Obama seems to be doing well are not necessarily those in which you know, questions of inequality and of populist economics are that resonant?
Well, as I pointed out, you know, the states in economic distress don't seem to be moving as heavily toward the Democrats as states that have been economically booming. I don't fully I can't give you a full explanation of that because I haven't figured it out yet. I'm thinking, working on that. I think part of it is simply that the old, you know, political science models were based on an electorate that remembered the Great Depression of the 1930s and Franklin Roosevelt. The percentage of voters that remembers that is now about 4%, and it's not going to go up in the future. At the same time, Republicans benefited for many years from an electorate that remembered the 1970s, the gas lines that we got from overregulation, the stagflation that we got allegedly from big government. And that electorate said, well, gee, maybe big government's not such a good idea. Maybe we should cut taxes and so forth. The electorate this year, the median age voter was born about 1963. That voter never was behind the steering wheel in a gas line. They weren't paying bills in the 1970s. So it's a different electorate, and I think nobody that I know of has developed the rules to understand this. But it's interesting on the climate change bill. The initial impulse is we must do something about global warming. New York will be underwater by 2018 and so forth. Now suddenly people are saying, what, you're trying to pass a bill that will make gas more expensive? Help me understand how that is a good idea. And suddenly that has been taken off the agenda. And right now in the Senate, the Democrats are trying to get it off the agenda, and the Republicans are trying to keep it have it remain the order of business. So in a period of open field politics, things can turn out differently from what people expect, from what people employing the old rules expect to have happen. And I think we may continue to see some surprises going perhaps in the direction of both parties before this is over.
I think, Claudio.
There's a new poll that says that Obama's likely to get 62% of the Latino vote. But do you think that the Latino vote has overstated its importance?
Well, every vote is important. you've had, important percentages of Latinos vote in some of the close states in the past, Florida, New Mexico, and so forth, although the Latinos in Florida and New Mexico are very different sorts of people with different political histories and different sets of attitudes. I've seen that one poll. That's the only poll we've really had since Obama clinched the nomination that's looked at that specifically, and I'm not sure whether that's the last word on it. I was interested to see, Obama's weakness or Hillary Clinton's strength among Latino voters. I mean, there's been an assumption among liberal analysts that Latinos would be people of color and they'd vote just like blacks. Well, that hasn't proved to be the case. They vote more like white people than black people, if we're going to use those labels, just as a matter of arithmetic. And different groups vote differently in different ways. I thought that I was surprised by that 62% number. I would have expected McCain to run somewhat better than that and Obama somewhat worse. And will continue, Obama was getting, Hillary Clinton was getting 77, 80% of the votes in the lower Rio Grande Valley in the Texas primary, for example. Some of her best results in the country. So I think that's you've got voters there who in the 2000-2004 period were less strongly attached to either political party than most voters in the country. I think they're going to continue to be up for grabs. We will see interesting ways for candidates to appeal to them. It's generally been thought that McCain's position on immigration legislation might help him with some Latino voters. On the other hand, his change, at least in rhetorical stance, since that law was defeated and his saying we've got to enforce the border first, might presumably lessen that. It's interesting, I'm just told Obama has never been to Mexico.
As far as I know.
As far as maybe he went across the border. What? Pardon?
Hawaii.
Which is an interesting thing. McCain, like George W. Bush, is from a border state and has had, more contact with Mexico. But we'll see how that runs. And McCain is going down to visit Alvaro Uribe, while Obama says that he'd be willing to meet without preconditions with Hugo Chavez.
Thank you. We have a lot more questions, but we need to actually move on to our next panel, so we can give a round of applause to Michael Barone. And invite up the first panel. We're not going to take a break. We have a distinguished journalist, Charles Kraus, who's now in the private sector, but has a long career. You have bios for everyone out there, and he will be chairing this panel. Charles and the rest of the panel.
See you tonight. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, Charles. Nice to see you. You grew up north of Canada, too.
I'm not very far from where you
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, there's
Okay. Hey, nice to see you. I saw you the VP list. Have you been vetted yet?
5 minutes over.
I'm sorry.
Andrés,
I'll stand in the background.
If nominated, will you run?
¿cómo estuvo tu...?
¿Ya viste que Gutiérrez Vivó ganó su pleito? Bueno,
a los Aguirre.
millones de dólares. Ayer. ¿En serio?
Ya es la última instancia ya.
Y la instancia es la Suprema Corte.
No, lo que vi fue que le ganó Patricia Mercado a
Eso sí,
Beñat.
también. ¿Estás bien? ¿Pasaste bien la noche?
Muy tranquilo, muy
Bonita
descansado.
cama, muy cómodo.
Muy a gusto.
Lo menos para mí. How are you, Ambassador?
How come you get on both sides?
I am Ambassador because I'm a privileged individual, I think. How are you doing?
Doctor. ¿Dónde quedé? ¿Dónde están los nombres?
¿Dónde quieres? A ver. Perdón. No me tomaste la buena decisión de ir al sector privado. Sí, ahora voy a tirar el gato sobre
Let's see. I think you're... Hola, Chris.
How's Olivia?
Fine. Did Lynn come with you?
No, she was just recently right here. Grandparents, and she is first.
Well, luck of the draw. I don't know how this.
Okay.
Help her.
I think it depends on who looks sleepy. Hi, Cindy.
If you would take your seats, please, we'll begin. First of all, I want to thank Andrew for inviting me to moderate today's panel. I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panelists in alphabetical order, and then we'll begin. Chris Arcos is currently a senior advisor to Preston Gates and former ambassador to Honduras, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs and Homeland Security, former Vice President at AT&T. Brian Dyson is currently President of Chatham International and former President of Coca-Cola. Jim Jones, everyone knows, President of Manat Jones, former Ambassador to Mexico, and a member of Congress from 1973 to 1987. Andres Rozental, President of Rozental and Associados, Senior Fellow at Brookings, former Mexican Ambassador to the UK, Sweden, United Nations in Geneva. And finally, Javier Trevino, Senior Vice President at CEMEX, former Deputy Foreign Minister of Mexico, Deputy Finance Minister of Mexico, and spokesman at the Mexican Embassy during the NAFTA negotiations, which is where we first met many years ago. I've asked each of the panelists before we started whether they are in any way connected to any of the campaigns or advising any of the candidates. Our two guests from Mexico said no, which is which is fortunate. Chris Arcos said that he is indirectly involved with the McCain campaign, and Ambassador Jones said that he was advising one of the unsuccessful Democratic candidates, Hillary Clinton. So I think it's important for transparency reasons to know where people are. And Brian Dyson said he's not involved with either of the campaigns. So let me begin by asking a question that I think is the subject of our panel today, of our discussion, which is, which of the two candidates is going to be best for the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship? Let me begin with Chris. Not your personal favorite, but for the relationship.
I think when you put it in those terms, Charles, the bilateral relationship, I would have to say John McCain, simply just because of his history, Arizona, immigration reform, and I think that he's been close to the issues. The support of NAFTA, and I think also the anti-drug issues that we've had with Mexico. I think he's very familiar. I think Obama is somewhat more unknown in this area, and I can get into it in my discussion. Do you want me to?
No, this is fine.
Okay.
That's just fine. Let me ask Ambassador Jones, which of the two candidates do you think will be best for the bilateral relationship?
Well, in full disclosure, I will be supporting Obama, even though I supported Hillary in the primary, and yet John McCain is a good friend of mine. So I'd pull it on strictly U.S. Mexico relations, basically a draw. Obama, I think, has the sensitivity, the multicultural background, and the appreciation of Mexico that will make him very sensitive to that relationship. McCain has done a number of things over the years. It's not well known, but when I was ambassador and Pete Wilson was governor of California, he was running for re-election in '94 on an anti-immigrant issue and bashing Mexican illegal immigrants, etc. And it was causing a great deal of problems for me and for our bilateral relationship. And I went to see Pete, and it was obviously a political ploy that worked in '94. My big concern in '96 was that the Republican candidate, in that case Bob Dole, would use the same ploy because there was a lot of pressure within the Republican Party to do that. And I called on two people to neutralize that. One was the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, and the other was the senator from Arizona, John McCain. McCain was traveling almost constantly with Dole, and I have to give both of them great credit because they kept the lid on within the Republican Party and within the Dole campaign, and it was not an issue. All that is to say, however, it's hard to tell because in an election, elections do matter to people who are running for office. I was elected 7 times in a 14-year career in Congress, and there's a certain mystique about elections and the voice of the people, which candidates truly hear. And so what all the candidates are hearing today is that the American people, blue-collar and white-collar alike, are scared to death. Scared that they will not be able to maintain their standard of living or that their children will not be able to. And it's worse than I saw in the late 70s when the Arab oil embargo was frustrating the American economy. And these candidates are responding to that, some in rhetoric a little more harsh than others, but all of them, even McCain, changed his position on immigration to basically a slightly different position on immigration so that it wouldn't cause him problems in the primary. So I think the issue is whether Obama and McCain can focus on real issues as opposed to phony issues. I think they both will try. I think they both will probably succeed. And if that happens, I think either one of them will have a good relationship with Mexico.
Andres, which would be better for Mexico, for the U.S. Mexico relationship?
I think, the conventional wisdom in Mexico has always been that we prefer Republicans to Democrats. I think if you ask an average person in Mexico who deals with these issues, they will tell you that historically Mexico has done better under Republican administrations than under Democratic administrations. Why? I think because Republicans are seen as being perhaps more pragmatic, less ideologically motivated. They are more business friendly. NAFTA was negotiated fundamentally and brought about under a Republican administration, even though it was a Democratic administration that pulled it through Congress. Republicans have been traditionally less concentrated on some of the issues that used to be flashpoints between Mexico and the United States, issues of human rights, democracy, and so on. But I think that's changed. I think that very much like Michael's analysis of the change to the red and the blue state issue, there's been a fundamental change in Mexico as well. Obama evidently arouses lots of sympathy in Mexico. I think because of his status as a minority, a representative of a minority, a representative of a traditionally, at least historically, an underclass. There are a lot of things that make Obama an attractive individual. And I don't think this is just Mexico's case. I think this is the case around the world. Everybody will look at Obama as their favorite candidate from the point of view of how he is seen from outside his multinational, multiracial, multicultural background is something that is extremely attractive. McCain, as I think Chris Arcos says, is someone who's perhaps more familiar with Mexico. He has been traditionally more involved with the issues on the Mexican-U.S. bilateral agenda. But my own feeling is, and in this I'm somewhat sympathetic to what was said earlier, there's going to be a great deal of difficulty for either of the two candidates to focus on the U.S.-Mexico relationship, at least at the outset of the administrations. To begin with, in the U.S., we all have seen how long it takes for a new administration to settle into government, especially when there's a change of party. And I think that we'll be hard pressed to see anything fundamentally happening in the first perhaps 6 to 12 months of a new administration. In Mexico, there's always a tendency to think that, you know, the day after everything changes. When President Fox won the elections in the year 2000, everybody thought that the next day Mexico would wake up in a different country. And of course, the expectations were so high and the realities were so evident afterwards that there was a great deal of disappointment. I think the same thing will happen whoever wins the election here in the United States from the point of view of Mexican perceptions. Now, McCain, or the Republican candidate, obviously has to deal with the realities of the bilateral relationship these last 8 years under the Bush administration. It's a bilateral relationship that is fundamentally perceived to be, in public opinion at least, on both sides of the border, as being at a very low point in terms of history. The perceptions are that the relationship is really doing poorly. The reality, of course, is somewhat different. There's always been this two-track issue between Mexico and the United States. Those who are involved in the relationship know that the relationship is much better than what the public opinion perceives it to be. I think sometime later today we're going to find out that Mexican tomatoes were to blame for 150 salmonella infections in the southern part of the United States, and that's going to be a big deal because it's a lot of tomatoes and a lot of money for Mexican tomato producers. But I think that on the immigration issue, McCain is perceived in Mexico, as I think he's perceived in the Latino community here in the United States, as having opted for political expediency over his own convictions. And I think that's something he's going to have to pay for among Latino voters. It's true there's only been one poll, but the fact is that I think Obama will do much better among Latino voters than he did during the Democratic primary campaign.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll come back to some of these issues in some detail. But just to be clear, are you saying that Obama or McCain in the end would be better? Which would be better? You kind of hedged that quite a bit. As did Ambassador Jones, by the way.
I didn't mean to hedge it because I actually didn't finish. But I think at the end of the day, we would be better under a McCain administration at the outset. I think that at the initial stages, a McCain administration would probably be more in tune with some of the issues on the agenda.
Okay. Let me ask Mr. Dyson, do you agree with that?
Well, I think the principal thing is that both candidates, whoever gets elected, are going to be very slow to act. I think a lot of the principal issues affecting Mexico will probably be viewed as somewhat radioactive, but I think all of them are going to be hugely overshadowed by two principal issues that a new president is going to have to deal with in the United States. One of them is the issue of the economy. And by that, I mean every ramification that affects that. Energy policy, treasury policy, the whole thing. And the other one is Middle East policy. I think those things are so hugely important to this issue that whoever gets elected is going to be slow to address the Mexican issues and other hemispheric issues. But I'm not shying away from your question. I think that if you're asking who would be better, I think it's very close. I don't really have all the elements to make a judgment, but I would have to go on track. I think it would probably be McCain, but I reiterate, it will not come until considerably into the 4-year term. I think politics is the art of the possible, and I think both candidates would want to have a certain amount of favorable momentum before they dealt with some of the very tricky issues like immigration.
Thank you. And Javier.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I mean, you can argue either way. I mean, in terms of, I was reading El Mercurio newspaper from Chile with an exclusive interview with Obama. Done by a Hispanic reporter, Jorge Ramos, and when he is stating clearly, Mr. Obama, that Mexico is going to be a priority for his administration, of course, once the Iraq war is over. And so it is interesting to listen to some of the issues that he's stating there. And of course, you can argue in the case of Senator McCain and his knowledge about Mexico and how he has been in favor of free trade and NAFTA. What I'm sure is that Mexico will win when the electoral process is over. And because already, the U.S. election had a significant impact so far. So it blocked shared solutions to many important issues like security cooperation, like immigration, like strengthening NAFTA. And it seems to me that the electoral cycle has been an unfortunate waste of precious time. And as Andr said, we're going to have to wait until the new administration is in the White House, and then the team is confirmed, and then we're going to see after the first quarter of next year how we're going to be dealing. So the thing is that there are many issues pending. We have to wait another half a year to establish new channels of communications and find new ways of improving complex relationships. And no matter who the winner is, Senator McCain or Senator Obama, the important thing is that there is a new president in the White House, a new team confirmed, and then we can start working in trying to solve the new issues. And if you look, I was just in my way to Washington, I was looking to the issue of Time Magazine this week, and you can see a map here on how the Americans voted, by counties. And if you look at the border between Mexico and the U.S., all is red, which has to do with Mrs. Clinton is the one who won all the counties around the U.S. Mexico border. And if you look at the red here, you see that it was Mrs. Senator Clinton, the one who knew about states that had to deal with Mexico, and not Mr. Obama. So it's a great deal of new learning and understanding about the issues that have to be made during the campaign. But we will see how. And at the end of the day, and I will continue, in none of the questions, but the important point is not who wins here, but how the Mexican government is able to manage the foreign policy development process in order to deal with a new kind of bilateral relationship.
But again, and let me just be precise, which of the two candidates at the end of the day do you think will be better for the relationship?
It could be argued the way I would say with Brian Dyson said. It is not clear, but I would like to maybe to go disagree with the rest of the world, but maybe the Democratic candidate would be very good for having a new, fresh, renewed impact in the U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship.
Okay. Next question is this. Do any of the panelists expect the relationship itself to become a major issue during the campaign? Is Mexico or any of the most important issues going to come to the fore during the next 6 months or so? Who wants to answer that? Chris?
First of all, I think that in dealing with Mexico in this election, there are three basic issues or pillars. And we've mentioned that most of the panelists, immigration, trade, NAFTA here in this case, and immigration being the possible reform of immigration. The other one is drugs, with currently the debate on the Mérida Initiative. I think all three of these manifest themselves, and having been at Homeland Security for the last 3.5 years and having dealt with Mexico quite closely on this issue as well as Canada on cross-border issues, I think immigration, trade, and drugs all become a cross-border issue with the United States. And I think that this is where I would venture to say that the new Department of Homeland Security is probably in the forefront of the whole policy making as we treat Mexico in these three areas. Trucking still is to be signed off, and how that is going to be done. I will not say who said it at Homeland Security, but before I left, they said trucking is a Dubai ports issue, ready to happen when it starts. The other issue and that's part of the NAFTA. The other one is the Merida Initiative and how we manage the sensitivities of sovereignty and how that will be managed. And here we have to understand, even if McCain wins, we're going to have an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress. So it's not going to be just what Mr. McCain, if he is president, says we're going to do with Mexico. It won't happen that easily, given the contentiousness we have, particularly with immigration, trade, and to a certain degree with drugs. On immigration, I would say a little vignette here. I was asked about 15 years ago during the Salinas Gortari administration, and I was in government at that time, to help counsel the Mexican government, elements of the party actually, the PRI, in how to establish a Cuban-American National Foundation type of organization in this country. And I quickly said it couldn't be done because the Cuban-Americans, or they also said like APEC, in other words, a lobbying group. This becomes a part of the Latino expectation that they're going to vote in favor of what Mexico feels it's favorable to them. And I quickly just said, not to go on too much, I quickly just said, you cannot have a Mexican-American foundation like you have Cuba, because Mexico is not a captive nation nor a state under siege. And we're not run by exile mentality here in terms of the Mexican-American. It's an immigrant mentality as opposed to an exile mentality. And the Mexican-American will not get involved as a group with the political issues inside of Mexico, only how it pertains to the Mexican-American community. So that in dealing with the Latino vote, we have to understand that Mexico cannot rely on the Mexican Americans to vote a certain way in their favor in terms of all this. So anyway, just to conclude, I think that the border and what we do, how we treat the border with a muro, with a wall, with more vallas, more obstacles and all that, I think this is going to have an enormous effect on the relationship. And lastly, the way we conduct ourselves on the immigration reform. If it happens like California under Wilson, where it went from anti-illegal to anti-immigrant to anti-Hispanic to anti-Mexican, the Republican Party suffered enormously in California for that.
Let me rephrase my question and ask the other panelists. Obama has been talking about 4 more years, and he's also talked in Florida about the lost opportunities that the Bush administration have had with Mexico, as we remember. So my question is this: does it make sense for Obama? Does anyone expect that Obama is going to raise Mexico as a foreign policy failure on the part of the Bush administration and try to tie that failure to what might be expected from McCain? Anyone? Andr?
I think the quick answer to your question is no. I think that the failures of the Bush administration will be raised undoubtedly in foreign policy, on foreign policy issues, particularly on the U.S.'s image abroad, which has suffered in Mexico as it's suffered pretty much everywhere in the world. But most probably, if it's raised at all in the campaign, it would probably be raised more on the basis of Latin America, the region, than Mexico itself, partly because I think that there have been more successes in the bilateral relationship than people are generally aware of, and therefore I think it's probably not a good idea to sort of put your eggs in the failed Bush policy towards Mexico. I think in Mexico itself, if you ask me from the perspective of Mexico, in general, I don't think that the Bush administration is seen as having been a failure from the point of view of the bilateral relationship. There are obviously disappointments, things that didn't get done, expectations that weren't realized. But I don't think that that's going to be an issue.
Mr. Dyson.
I think that I totally agree that the issues of trade, security, and immigration are the most important issues. The one that I would really like to see raised is the role of Mexico as hemispheric partner. But I don't think that will be raised. And in general, I don't expect huge atmospherics. The place where it could take place would be on immigration, but I don't see that as advantageous to either candidate. But again, I feel that this is not as poignant an issue, the hemispheric role, and indeed the U.S. relationship with the hemisphere as a whole, not just particularly Mexico. But I think that is very important. It's very important for Mexico because I think over the last 8 years, that role has been diminished. And I'm very sorry to see that.
Ambassador Jones, what are the politics of the relationship this year?
Well, I don't think either candidate is going to use Mexico as the reason for our woes in this country. So I don't think we need to worry about that. I agree with Andres that Obama needs to appeal to the Hispanic voter in this country, and one of the ways he's going to do it will be to use our situation, our respect within Latin America, and how that's deteriorated over the last 8 years. And I think he will hammer hard on that issue. The issues of immigration, trade, and security and drugs will come up in the immigration area. I think both candidates will have essentially the same rhetoric. They will both say we have to secure our borders first. They will have to say we will support some sort of a guest worker program, and they will leave absent much of the discussion on the undocumented Hispanic or undocumented immigrants who are in this country today. On the issue of trade, I think in certain states you will expect Obama to continue to hammer on trade with the two issues of labor and environment being what will be part of his trade agenda. And I think he'll probably hammer on NAFTA. And if you parse carefully what he's said on NAFTA, basically that can be cured by taking the side agreements on trade and environment that we already have and are working in all three countries and put them as part of the treaty. And say, sort of like Senator Aiken on Vietnam said, declare victory and go home. That, I think, will cure that particular issue. And I think you'll see Mccain relatively silent on the issue of NAFTA, and particularly in the swing states that both candidates have to carry if they're going to win.
Let me ask Javier, from the point of view of Monterrey and the people in Monterrey and the people you work for, are you worried that that Obama might be serious about reopening NAFTA, and what would that mean if he were?
Well, it was a serious campaign promise, and just to reopen or to at least analyze what's going on with NAFTA. I agree with Jim Jones, what he's saying about the importance of reframing the issue in terms of looking into the environmental and labor issues and some kind of parallel agreements, that there is a way to go away from campaign promises to work into public policy measures. So I would say that it is going to be interesting to see how he goes about it. He said, in this recent interview that he might be reviewing carefully what is happening with NAFTA. But what is important about NAFTA is that has become a very important, through the years and since the negotiation, a very important instrument for organizing the bilateral relationship, given, the different stakeholders or audiences that we have in the two countries. So NAFTA has been an articulator or facilitator for the bilateral relationship. So we have to pay a lot of attention to not to eat the poison pill of opening or reopening NAFTA, because that might be, very dangerous, to say the least. And because from the time we negotiated NAFTA to today, there are too many different things. First of all, NAFTA was a success story. It was an engine of economic growth in North America. Second, there are two important elements in the U.S. that were not present at the time, and could be obvious, but they are important. One is internet, new technologies, and two is NGOs networks. And it's very different, the situation here, for reopening or renegotiating a trade agreement like this one with these new factors in the U.S. and in Mexico. It would be very difficult. That would force to Mexico to really reorganize itself, to the Mexican government, and to launch a real effective communications and lobbying campaign all around the U.S., which is not happening today. But NAFTA has been good. Of course, the idea is how to continue with that. And if I can just make a point, I was fascinated by Michael Barone's analogies, comparisons, and similarities between the Mexico and the U.S. election, the 2006 Mexico election, 2008 American election. And he mentioned all the right points. The only point that he didn't mention was one important and determinant issue that I'm not sure if that is going to happen here as well, which was the fear factor. And that had to do that at the end of the Mexico election has to do with AMLO es un peligro para Mexico, right? It was the final point in the negative advertising on that. And I don't know if that thing about is Obama or not a danger for the U.S. and the crafting of the negative advertising at the end of the campaign is going to happen, and how that might impact some of the important security issues, immigration issues, and trade issues that we're dealing between Mexico and the U.S.
That's an interesting point, and I wonder if we can expect the loser of the election to try to paralyze Washington for a couple of months while we sort it out. Senator McCain, I've been reading through some of his more recent statements, and on NAFTA, Obama made the comments about reopening it, and I think the general consensus is that probably won't happen in a serious way. McCain was talking about sending back 2 million undocumented workers who have been involved in some kind of infractions or criminal activity in this country. Does anyone on the panel think that if he's elected, we will suddenly send back millions of people to Mexico in the next couple of years?
I think only if the immigration debate actually happens after the election, and I think that'll be a part of either candidate or whoever wins. It'll be a part of any immigration bill that those who have criminal convictions of some sort will not be eligible for any kind of special treatment other than be sent back to their home country. And I think that's been generally true among most of the candidates throughout the campaign.
Chris, you wanted to say something?
Well, having dealt with that very issue for 3.5 years, let me say that the law already says, Jim, that if there's an infraction, a criminal record, a DUI, a misdemeanor, just the slightest thing for a foreigner to commit in the United States, even a legal resident, can lose his rights under the new 97 and then the way it was beefed up after 9/11 immigration law. So I think that these 2 million that we're talking about have been identified, approximately 2 million, have been identified as falling in that non-eligibility. So you're going to see, and you're seeing ICE, which is the agency that handles this, beefed up and to try to identify more of these people and remove them, detention and deportation. But on these figures, we have to be careful. There's an official consensus that there's about 11 or 12 million undocumented workers in this country. Bear Stearns, before it went under, had a study that had roughly between 15 and 20 million. and some people say that it's in between. 14 to 16 million is a real number. And people ask, why is it that the government doesn't deal with the real numbers? Well, it's politically not acceptable for either party to try to deal with the real numbers in a way, because then you have to do something about it. And I think this is sort of the elephant in the room when we talk about immigration, and when we get to that point in the debate, be it a year from now or not, the numbers are staggering, quite frankly. And I think this is going to take a lot of imagination, whether it be Obama or McCain, to manage this and to bring the American people along with this. And I think that there are a lot of pitfalls here and danger. But I don't see us rounding up people unless they're criminals wholesale. And I think Governor Ridge and both Secretary Chertoff have said that publicly.
Okay. Andres, you indicated you
Well, I wanted just to perhaps change the focus a little bit. I mean, it's great to ask us as Mexicans what we think is going to happen in the United States, but I think it'd be interesting also to say what's happening in Mexico, especially vis-a-vis the U.S. relationship. The predominance that Chris mentions of DHS over DOS in terms of the bilateral relationship is something which has evidently changed the nature of the relationship. It is no longer, shall we say, a foreign policy relationship. It is an internal domestic security relationship. And that is evidently, that change has changed the focus in Mexico on the U.S. relationship. Now, we have a government in power right now in Mexico and an individual at the helm of that government that is fundamentally, I would say, uncomfortable with the United States. This is not Salinas, it's not Fox. Calderon is not a comfortable person insofar as his perceptions of the relationship and his perceptions of the United States. It goes back a little bit to the history of his political party. The PAN has traditionally and historically been an anti-American party from the point of view of its origins and its history. And I think that, in essence, Calderon has to be dragged here. He doesn't come here out of desire. He comes here out of necessity when he's come, which has been very, very little. You must remember that it's the first president in a long, long time that hasn't made an official visit to the United States. He's come here to see the Mexican community and so on, but he's now 1.5 years in office, and there has not been a formal bilateral official visit. At the same time, you have the political polarization in Mexico, which has used the U.S. and its relationship with Mexico very much on the domestic political scene. In the energy reform discussion that's going on today in Mexico, the dialogue, so-called dialogue, you hear constantly the Frente Amplio, the opposition, in effect, saying that what Calderon wants to do in the energy reform is to sell Mexico's resource to the United States, fundamentally. And so wrap yourself up again in the flag, bring out all the old sovereignty issues, everything that is antithetical to NAFTA and to what has been done over the last 15 years is what is dominating the political debate today in Mexico. So between those factors and the fact that we have elections, midterm elections in Mexico next year in July, in which we will have a total change in the lower house of Congress, gubernatorial elections, and the probability that the PAN, the party in power, will not do particularly well in those elections, and that probably you will have more PRI members of Congress. All of that indicates to me that, again, irrespective of who's sitting in the White House in Washington, the relationship is going to be difficult, and that therefore it is wrong to expect either Mr. McCain or Mr. Obama to fundamentally change the situation as it is today. Fortunately, Chris mentioned the Merida Initiative. Fortunately, for the relationship, not for anything else, I think that has now been solved. There is a consensus text, which has come out of the upper and the lower house of the U.S. Congress, which will probably be voted on sometime this week or very early next week, and which will, in effect, backtrack from all of the conditionalities and things that that were put in the House version. I think that is now no longer a major issue, but in the bilateral relationship. But there are lots of other issues, and those other issues, I think, will continue to fester in terms of whoever's sitting here.
I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience after I ask one more question. So if you want to begin to think of what you might like to ask, I'll do that in a minute. My last question is, Andres Oppenheim in the Miami Herald recently wrote that the Democrats in Congress who are trying to cut money, about $190 million or so, from the Merida Initiative allocation, he's saying that McCain might be able to use that to somehow win over some of the Latino vote in the United States. And my real question is, do Latino voters, Mexican-American voters in the United States, necessarily vote based on U.S. policy towards Mexico? And is that something that the candidates have to worry about?
My own feeling is no. I don't think they do. I think that it is, as somebody mentioned, a very heterogeneous group of people and a very heterogeneous group of interests. And I think most of them will first vote on domestic political issues here in the United States as it affects them than they would on relations with Mexico issues. The one exception to that, I think, is McCain's volte-face, if you want, on immigration. I think that is a liability to him in terms of the Latino vote in general. I think not because necessarily Latinos may be pro or anti-immigrant. I think it's more because he was a champion for comprehensive immigration reform, and having been politically expedient and dropped that, I think people will fundamentally qualify him or say that he is not that he doesn't have firm convictions.
I don't know what the polls show today, but over the years since I've been ambassador and during that time, I didn't see any correlation between domestic discussion of issues affecting Mexico and the voting patterns of Mexican Americans. Even Prop 187, when we polled in California, as many Mexicans were for it as against it, basically. So the one issue, and I think Andres raises that, is when the rhetoric is translated to mean it's against Mexicans, and then I think they're in trouble. I don't think either party has sent that kind of message out, so I don't think that's going to be a problem. And I don't think the Merida Initiative, it is too narrowly focused and too complex to be a significant campaign issue.
Anyone else want to comment before we? All right, Chris.
I would agree with my colleagues up here that I don't think it's going to be an issue in terms of Mexican-American voters, and they are very dissimilar in many ways, Texans from Californians and the mountain states and what have you. I do believe that if it comes down to it, as Jim just said, and it was insinuated earlier, that the immigration debate, or if it comes up in the campaign, which is very doubtful, becomes anti-Latino, anti-Hispanic, or anti-Mexican, then you're going to see a rallying around that. But I think when you talk Merida, when you talk trucking, when you talk immigration reform, I had one of my last trips, Jim, I had to testify before or talk to the Joint Committee in the Congress of Mexican Congress that was dealing with immigration, and I was asked, why is it that the Hispanic community, Latino community, is not rallying around the immigrants and pushing forth their agenda? And I said, well, quite frankly, of the three main groups, Mexicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans, Cubans don't have an immigration issue. They don't have a dog in the dog fight. Puerto Ricans even less because they're born American. And the Mexican Americans, these are the ones that vote. There are very few still Central Americans that vote. and the rest are largely disenfranchised. But of these three groups, the Mexican Americans are divided generationally. The more recent ones are more attuned to the immigration issue. The ones that have been here 8 generations, like I have on my father's side, it's insignificant. And then I was asked, why is it that the Mexican Americans, not all of us, support the immigrants? And I said, well, it's like somebody said about Italian immigration many years ago. The last guy in kicks the ladder.
Okay. Let me. George Grayson.
George Grayson, the College of William and Mary, and I also am an aficionado of the Almanac of American Politics. I remember that $16. It was Dewey versus Truman. My questions are to the ambassadors, Arcos and Jones. Ambassador Arcos, when we had the mad cow disease, we were able to isolate the culprit, so to speak, on a farm, I think, somewhere in Montana, and address the problem. 33 to 40% of illegal aliens come into the country legally with valid visas and then disappear into the population as a whole. Why can't Homeland Security do a better job of finding those overstays? I'm sure that MasterCard would find me if I missed 2 or 3 payments. The second question to Ambassador Jones, who's forgotten more about practical politics than I can ever hope to learn, is that wouldn't there be less chance for immigration reform if Barack Obama were elected? Because that would probably galvanize the Republicans against him just because they don't want to see him succeed. Not that Republicans would ever play petty politics. Plus, you would have the Heath Shuler branch of the Democrats who would be helping the Republicans or joining the Republicans. However, if Mr. McCain were to win, the GOP is supportive, or many elements of the GOP are supportive, but also you would have the Pelosi-Reed backing for a rather ambitious piece of legislation.
Chris, I think the first part was to you.
The DHS issue, why is what about its inability to track these people down? I think the numbers are even higher than 33%. Some people have said as high as 40 come in with visas and proper documentation and just overstay. That's the big debate with the Middle Europe and Eastern Europe and the new visa waiver issues with Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and other countries of that region. There's quite a few overstays. But the issue is tracking them down. I'll give you an example. We have over 40,000 identified process Chinese citizens that have gone through detention and ready for deportation. We can't track them down. We've identified them. I guess we can't get into all the Chinatowns in the country. The fact is we don't have the money to house them, to hold them, and there's an even bigger problem. Many countries outside of Mexico, which we have a different arrangement, you have to have travel documentation, and many countries will not give you the travel. They don't want them back. They want the remittances. They'd rather have that. So they won't give us the travel documents, so they're stuck here in a limbo. So, and then they're released into the community. That's on the Chinese aspect, and I can repeat that for many countries. Most of Latin America is not under that regime. We have arrangements with Central America that we identify, and we get travel documentation from the Nicaraguans, Hondurans, and Salvadorans primarily. With Mexicans, it's return them on the spot almost. But it's very difficult to track people down in this country. I learned one thing, George. in dealing with the Europeans. It's the issue of privacy. We do not have a national ID card. Until we have that, we'll be able to do that much more efficiently. The fact of the matter is, Americans will tell Visa card everything about their lives, but won't tell the government. The Europeans will tell the government, but not Visa card. It's a cultural concept of how we deal with information. So these are impediments clearly to try to track down people.
Okay. And the second part of that question to
the second
Ambassador
part
Jones.
is whether it's politically possible or who has the best chance to pass an immigration bill. Something very interesting is happening in the body politic, which I hope is going to be manifest in this election. We have had a generation of high degree of partisanship in this country, starting in the first Reagan term, after the attempted assassination. I was budget chairman, so I understand this. But they made a policy decision to have a highly partisan budget showdown, fiscal policy showdown, which they won. And then on the Democratic side, Tip O'Neill was the speaker, and he had a highly partisan response to that. And it kept growing until the first George Bush, who tried to reinstate some bipartisanship, and he had his head handed to him. And then it went highly partisan from then on. What I'm sensing in the electorate is that they're tired of it. And I think that one of the things that both McCain and Obama are preaching is that they will cross party lines. They will reach out. And they will do the kinds of things that we did when I was in the White House, in the Johnson administration, always include the other side before you send up any kind of legislation. So I think whoever wins will reach out to the other side, and I think there's a reasonably good chance, because the electorate, the population, is tired of this partisanship and no action in Washington. So I think there's a reasonably good chance that either one can get a bipartisan approach to that issue. The problem is, and Chris raised it at the end there, is on immigration, we first have to create the reason for doing anything. Right now, the American people have the best of both worlds. They have cheap labor that is not being protected, and at the same time, they can rail against illegal immigration. And so unless we have an immigration bill that has some verification, like the card that Chris is talking about, and unless, as Secretary Chertoff and his team are doing, and I think rightfully so, going after the employers who are hiring these illegals. Until that happens, you're not going to stop, I don't care how high the wall is, you're not going to stop illegal immigration. I can guarantee you if there are no jobs here, you'll stop it, and you don't even need a fence. And so until that happens, you're not going to stop illegal immigration. When that happens, then I think the American people will say, wait a minute, I need those restaurant workers. I need those people to keep my golf course up. I need a certain amount of immigrants coming in to keep our economy strong. And when that happens, I think you'll see Republicans and Democrats alike pass a good immigration bill that recognizes reality.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to take a couple of questions and try to bunch them together. Paulo.
Yes, Paulo Sotero, I'm at the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. The premise of the question ties to something Mr. Dyson said, is that in order to move on both the immigration and the trade issue, the next president will have to effectively deal with some of the domestic issues, socio-economic domestic issues in the United States that feed this feeling of economic insecurity. Maybe health care, maybe job training, maybe education. If the premise is correct, who do you think, and I will ask this to the Americans on the panel, would have the best chance to effectively deal with those issues in the context of apparently a broader Democratic majority in both houses, on both houses of Congress?
Go ahead.
I'm not American. I'm Argentine, so I defer to
Well, I personally think Obama will have the better chance of doing that because he would have, I think he's going to have an overwhelming majority of Democrats controlling both houses of Congress, and he would have the better outreach to the Democratic Congress to form the programs. McCain still has a good chance, though, and when I was not trying to evade the question from the first question. It is on these kinds of issues is close to a draw as to who would be best. On balance, however, I think Obama would because he believes in these issues, and I think he would take the initiative more than McCain. And with what McCain will still have, I think, are a lot of the people and many of the policies of the past 8 years, and it's going to be hard to shed himself of those.
An Argentine wants to speak after all. Well, go ahead.
I'm fundamentally an optimist, and I really believe that this election in some way that perhaps we can't even perceive despite this learned panel here is going to be beneficial to Mexico and I think to the hemisphere. I think that there's a tabula rasa here. I think we have gone through a period of neglect that has not been benign, and I fundamentally believe the most inspirational thing that I've heard here was what Ambassador Jones just said just now, that he feels it's going to be a return to bipartisanship. I really think that would be huge for Mexico and for the hemisphere. For the last 20 years, I have traveled extensively in Latin America, and everywhere I go, primarily from businessmen, that's my area of contact, people tend to say, referring to the U.S., they say, how do they see us? What do they say about us? And I always find that's a very, very uncomfortable question for me, because what do they say about us? The answer is not much, to be very candid. The United States, when it looks up and out, seems to look east or west. It's the phenomenon of, I guess, the historic Angel Island or Ellis Island influence. But I think that now Latin America is beginning to emerge as something that the U.S. is going to have to deal with. Whether it's the hegemony and the rise and the dynamic of Brazil, or it's the intransigence of Venezuela, the U.S. is going to have to pay more attention, which is what President Bush announced in his first term he was going to do. And then he was sidetracked. But I hope that time has come.
We're almost out of time, so let me ask both Javier and Andres if they would like to make one final comment about the election, how it may affect the relationship.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about this dilemma of the election between continuity or change in U.S. foreign policy and also U.S. Mexico bilateral relationship. And it seems to me that the odds are for continuity, no matter who wins in the U.S. and also on the side of the Mexican government. And the only way to have a real change will depend on the Mexican government. And the sense of urgency to get away from the silo mentality in managing the bilateral relationship and to have a much more integrated foreign policy towards the U.S. And so no matter who wins the election, the important thing is how Mexico prepares for taking advantage of the new administration.
Okay, and Andres.
Well, I just wanted to make a final point, Charles, and that is that when the Bush administration began at the very outset, I think that at least from the Mexican perspective, there was not much doubt in the genuity of President Bush's desire to put Mexico up on the priority list of the U.S. foreign policy agenda, and also to look at comprehensive immigration reform and other issues that were perturbing the bilateral relationship. The problem was, and this goes to what's going to happen here in January 2009, that nobody else in his administration had the slightest interest in doing that. From the Vice President down, through the Secretary of State, the Department of Justice, the Department of Commerce, there was no interest whatsoever in doing that. So, in effect, what happened was that you had a President of the United States who genuinely believed that this was an important thing to do, and an administration that was totally elsewhere. So I think a lot depends also on who Mr. McCain or Mr. Obama put in their administrations. Who's going to be the Secretary of Homeland Security? Who's going to be the Secretary of State? Who's going to be the Vice President? Is he going to give a role to any of these in terms of the bilateral relationship with Mexico, or she? Yes, well, I keep away from the gender issues, but I use he universally. The fact is,
like the Bible.
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right.
Like the Bible.
So I think it's important that we can't judge what's going to happen on the basis of one individual. I think it's extremely important to see how the whole thing shapes up. And Congress, you also have there will be a whole new set of actors in the U.S. Congress as well, and in the Mexican Congress.
Okay, to be fair, Chris gets one last minute.
My last minute, my last 30 seconds. I think what Andres has just pointed out is very interesting in terms of the expectation of who they put in government. Talking to many Latin ambassadors here, they're convinced it's going to be Bill Richardson for Obama, which obviously would have an enormous impact in Latin America. And at the same time, which I believe it'll be McCain. McCain will come from the Jim Baker school of thought, and I think more pragmatic, given his closeness to Colin Powell and people like that in the Republican Party. So I think that you're going to have a very practical approach to Mexico from either candidate at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. I think great discussion, and we'll take a break now, and thanks again.